On today's show, I am joined by Andrew Kelly of Peachtree Hoops for a summer check-in, and unfortunately, Vit Krejci is no longer a member of the Hawks. We'll get into all of that and more on the way.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 1537 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Wednesday evening into Thursday. And today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, a sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And also, please check us out anywhere you get your podcasts and make us your first listen each and every day. With all that out of the way, I am joined on today's podcast. I don't always do the live intro with the person already on the line with me, but he's a friend of the podcast. We're rolling live tonight, and it's Andrew Kelly of Peachtree Hoops and the Internet. Andrew, hello, sir. How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm living the dream. We were talking about doing this, and we got a little bit of news today, so I'm going to do this with you on the show as well, because you have, I'm sure, some sort of insight on this. But Vit Krejci is no longer a member of the Hawks organization. That was the big news. On Wednesday, the Hawks chose to waive him. If you've listened to the podcast for a while, you will probably know this is not a big surprise. He was the 16th player on a 15-person roster, and that generally means you're probably going to get waived at some point. I have predicted multiple times that if they didn't make a big trade, and they could still do that, but if they didn't make a trade, he was going to get waived, and he got waived today. Andrew, do you have any parting words for Vit Krejci at the end of an era? Nothing else, he was a fantastic bench celebrator.
Yeah, I agree with that. He seemed like a very good teammate.
Yes.
Our friend Wes Borton, I think it was him, he made a good comment once that he's like a quadruple A player, to use a baseball analogy, and I think that's probably pretty fitting for him. If he ended up in just like the right kind of situation where he could get more playing time and develop a little bit more, I could see how he could be, a fringe, possible rotation guy. I just don't think Atlanta was a great spot for him, but he did seem like a great bench guy as far as energy.
Yeah, and everybody loves him. Honestly, it was just a numbers game, so I won't go through the whole long spiel here. But basically, the Hawks had 15 guys still on guaranteed contracts. You can only carry 15 coming into the season. That does not include two ways, but they would have had to either trade someone or cut someone that had guaranteed money, or they could do the very easy thing in some respects, which was just move on from Vit. And I think, and no one's told me this directly, but I have a strong feeling that they did this now as kind of a favor to Vit, which might sound funny, but if you already knew that the likelihood or the strong likelihood that he was going to be waived in October, if you go ahead and do it now, it gives him a chance to go to camp with somebody else, maybe find a two-way contract or whatever, because I think he might have a job in the NBA next year. So I think this is something the Hawks have done, especially with Schlenk, but this is a new regime now, but they've liked to give guys sort of a little bit of a hand on the way out the door. And I think this is a small thing. He was non-guaranteed, so no money going to Vit here, but I think it's better for Vit to be cut now than it would have been to be cut sort of in October.
Yeah, fully. It gives them a better chance to explore what teams might be out there. I like to see him get an NBA job. I'm not totally confident he can stick as a long-term player, but hopefully that was motivated by just trying to find him a spot where he can get a little bit more time.
Yeah, and he is eligible for a two-way too, so that helps him. He still has the years of service required to do that, and there's just more jobs now with two ways, and there's 3 of those in every team. For somebody asked me this today, the Hawks could technically sign him to a two-way if he clears waivers, which he may. I will say he's on a fairly favorable contract if a team liked him, because it's non-guaranteed through January, so he might get picked up. But if he doesn't, the Hawks could technically sign him to a two-way. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but they're allowed to. Someone asked me that today as well. So from there, the real reason I was going to have you on the podcast is kind of just to touch on, what's going on in Hawksland. We're like 2 months away, basically now, from the actual season starting. We have the in-season tournament schedule, which I will hold off on talking about until tomorrow, because the actual schedule comes out on Thursday, the entire regular season schedule. Unless you have thoughts on that, we can kind of move on to like the changes that have happened. And, there aren't that many changes, but I have to start here, Andrew, because you and I have talked about this for years and years and years. The only major change to the roster, where I'm going with this, is the fact the Hawks traded John Collins for very little back, basically just dumped his contract. you and I have been on opposite sides of John Collins for a long time, but I do want to start there because, and honestly, just not to troll you or anything like that, but because like that is the only major move that they made, and there's been a lot of talk about like what that means for the roster. I did a podcast this week with Josh Lloyd, and like I had a win total that was higher than last year, and his question was basically like, didn't they get worse? And it's like, well, kind of like the roster is maybe worse, but also they have internal growth and all that stuff. So you can talk about this too, but what do you make of sort of that decision, and also the fact that they basically haven't done anything else other than just like stuff on the margins with draft picks and Wes Matthews, et cetera?
Well, on the Collins front, I think you could see that move coming for a while. I mean, he's been rumored to trade rumors for I don't know how many years now, like 3 or 4, it seems like.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was a surprise when they finally moved on. And the diminished offensive role, I just kind of think that it sort of made it inevitable that he was going to be moved on at some point. Utah, Danny Ainge is like a big fan of his as far as like he was always kind of lightly connected to rumors in Boston. So it didn't really surprise me that he ended up coming for him. And, obviously they should have traded him way before that. I think we're in like total agreement there that they should have never let his trade value get to the point to where he's a pure salary dump. But at the same time, I had said privately to you that leading up to the trade that I thought it was possible the best deal they might get was like, some kind of Marcus Morris filler deal from the Clippers that we have to eat a year of bad money and then you can move on. So to get completely off create that large trade exception, but they're probably not going to use, but just on paper is still nice. But declining importance to the Hawks, just continually moving down the totem pole as far as like the hierarchy goes, I think was a theme that we saw. I don't think he was a good fit really in either end for a Quin Snyder approach. So I think it was kind of inevitable that he moved on. He's still somebody that when you look at the multi-year sample, like you could be very encouraged for him from a Utah perspective. I don't know that the shot is going to get back to the way it was pre-finger injury. It's possible, but I think he's a better shooter at least than he was, 29% or so in Atlanta. So I think it probably was, it was definitely for the best for both sides, in my opinion. Something that I kind of come back to is that when you get 80% of what you want in a deal, a lot of times holding out for that extra 20 will burn you again and again. It's something you kind of have to learn in life. And I think the Hawks probably had some good offers for Collins. I know they had at least one good one from Sacramento. So they really just took way too long to get off of them. And then when it finally reached a point to where it was hard for it to be a sustainable fit for their team, his value was just so low that it just ended up being a pure dump. So, it's really a complicated facet because it involves how you look at their roster sheet. When you project down the line, getting off that much money really does become advantageous as far as having flexibility. I mean, it doesn't make them a cap space team, but it does remove a deal that was widely perceived as not being great from the equation. So I think that helps. But yeah, I mean, we've been prepared for this for a long time, so it wasn't like a shock or anything, but it's just unfortunate they couldn't get better value.
You brought up one of the things I want to ask you about, and that's kind of the long-term aspect as well, because, I've talked about ad nauseum about the Hawks tax avoidance, and they did it again this year, artfully, but they, I think the primary motivator on the Collins deal was to save money. There were fit issues as well that you bring up, and you're right about, like he wasn't a great fit with what Snyder necessarily wants, especially next to a center that can't shoot. But it's like looking ahead, this is one of the things I know you're really interested in, like team building wise. There are some interesting questions with this roster right now because it's going to be the same exact thing next year. Like you're going to look up a year from now, and I feel like it's going to be deja vu on this podcast and other places where I'm talking about like, okay, are they going to pay the tax again? Because you have extension possibilities with Saddiq Bey and Okongwu. And if you pay those guys what I would describe as something like market value and don't do anything else, you're in the tax again. And are they going to do a third straight season of basically shedding someone that they kind of like and that's a good player for not nothing, but for future capital in the Herter trade and basically nothing for Collins? Or are they going to actually, start to spend some money? I think the short answer is it depends on how they play this year probably, and also, ownership level stuff. But like big picture, because I know something you think about a lot, like what do you think of the way that they're building the roster, beyond the court? But court matters on this thing, but like as far as like how they're laying it out, because you have Trey, they paid DeJounte on a deal that everybody seems to like, including me, but that's a commitment that you have long term. You paid Hunter, etc. Like, from a cold calculation, cap team building standpoint, how are you feeling about the Hawks right now? Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is about to be kicking off, of course, and FanDuel is giving you a chance to win all season long because right now, when you win a Super Bowl winner, you can get bonus bets every single time they win in the regular season. Pick any team in the NFL to win the Super Bowl. You'll get bonus bets for each and every victory, and you use those bonus bets on point spreads and player props, over-unders, and much more. The FanDuel app is safe and secure, and they have all kinds of betting angles across the sports world for you that cover the whole range of sports. That includes, of course, football, NFL, college football, etc., NBA, WNBA, college basketball, MLB, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, all that fun stuff, hockey when it comes. They have everything that you're looking for at FanDuel, and there's no better place in the entire world to bet on all of the football and basketball action than America's #1 sports book. That is FanDuel, of course. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start earning those bonus bets right now. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon. Check out FanDuel today.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can go with this, and we'll probably touch on it later, I'd imagine, with Siakam. But what I personally think that, my read of the situation that they're trying to do is this summer was really about just cleaning up the cap sheet that didn't make a lot of sense. If you looked at the way that the team was perceived around the league, I remember a prominent cap space guy just looking at their sheet and just was very negative about it. And it made a lot of sense to me too, especially after the exits, in the first round of playoffs both years. It was kind of a capped out roster. But what I think they're trying to do is they have a pretty impressive group of young guys overall. I mean, they have Jalen Johnson, Griffin, Okongwu, and now they've added Bupkin to the equation. I'm not completely certain, but I believe they have about 3 tradable first-round picks. Everybody always kind of assumes the DeJounte trade was for a lot more than it was. I've heard people think they gave up 4 first-round picks or something like that, and that obviously wasn't the case. So they still can build a pretty impressive offer for an established star. And I think that's what they're going to do eventually. Siakam may not be the guy that they end up getting, but they're going to be pretty aggressive in trying to add that third player around Trey and DeJounte. And they have a decent amount of options with their young guys and future picks that they can cobble together. They can do that. And at the same time, they're trying to make sure that they don't have deals that are perceived as negative on their books, so they could potentially send that out in the trade and not have that be counted as bad value, or just have more optionality with the roster in general. And when you look at the cap sheet right now, I mean, they have DeJounte on what's clearly a team-friendly deal. You have Trey at market value. Really, Hunter is the only guy where I think you can point to and say that deal is probably not great. I mean, it's still movable. You can still get something, I think, for Hunter, but it's probably not great. So otherwise, I think the cap sheet is pretty, remarkably improved. I mean, maybe remarkable is a little bit of an overstatement, but just moving on from Collins and getting DeJounte on such a nice deal, I think it's pretty big for the long term. So I think they do have a lot of options. I mean, eventually, I do expect them to make a pretty sizable move for a third guy, just combining young players and picks.
Yeah, I think they clearly want to. It's just whether that actually comes around, because Siakam is the one that we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, it's interesting because I can see all sides of this. I've laid it out the way that you just did about look, they don't really have any bad contracts. Hunter is the one that's debatable, but I do think, and from what I even heard this summer, they could have moved Hunter pretty easily. The thing they're trying to treat Hunter like positive value. They're trying to treat Hunter like positive value, which you can debate, and I don't think that's a positive value contract. But if it was just hey, we're really urgent to dump DeAndre Hunter's contract, they could have done it very easily. That's not what they were trying to do, but that generally means that it's not a terrible contract. It may not be a great one, but it's okay. And Capella, same thing. Capella's appropriately paid right now for what he is. Bogey's a long-term deal, but it's declining. DeJounte, everyone liked that deal. Trey is Trey. So I agree with you on that standpoint, but then I take a step back, and I know you follow these circles too. I think nationally, it's kind of okay, the Hawks are capped out. They're not taxed out like they could have been, and they're not. But they also don't have a ton of flexibility naturally. I think they have flexibility in the literal sense of if they really want to do something, they could. But they don't have cap space. They don't have these screaming bargain contracts. They don't have the one blue chip young player that they know they can trade. I know I like AJ, I like Jalen, but to this point, those guys are not viewed as these world-changing assets across the league. So I'm not sure what the question is. It's more I'm fascinated by the discussion because I kind of feel like they're in decent shape, but also, and I'm not trying to go back to this all the time, but if they are not willing to spend, it does become harder because under your proposition there of basically going out and getting a third star, they have the assets to do it, no question. They have the filler salary, they have enough picks capital probably to do it, especially when you factor in guys like AJ and Jalen if you need to trade those guys. But are you willing to commit the financial resources? Because if you look at how teams are built now, if you have a guy making the real max, which is what Trey is making, if you're trying to build a three player team, you have to be willing to pay into the tax, and they just haven't been willing to get there. And that's the big question, I guess.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. I mean, if you have a player on the 30% max that Trey's on, then you really have to be willing to be a luxury team if you have the expectation of a team that's going to go deep in the playoffs. There's really no way around that. And this ownership group has never paid a luxury tax famously, so it's something that you kind of have to see until you believe it. I do think eventually they're going to come to a point where they're going to have to do it, or they're going to run into problems with personnel.
Yes.
longer term, I mean, I don't think you can expect them to keep all of their young guys, but I think a lot of it right now is just trying to maintain a flexible position. Like I said, you don't really have bad deals on the books. I mean, Hunter's kind of an asterisk, but and then you have some young guys that you would like to see in larger roles to get a better evaluation of them. We still have not yet seen, a Kongwu in a starting role. Griffin is still somebody that's probably going to be like the eighth, middle rotation type player this year. Jalen Johnson's obviously poised for a bigger role this year. So we'd like to get a longer look at them to kind of get a better sense of what their ceiling could be and what their trade value could be, how they might fit with the pieces longer term. So I think really the main goal of this offseason has just been trying to create more flexibility and, importantly, more playing time for the young guys to get longer looks there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because of what, I think about teams that were famously seen as cheap, like let's just say Denver. Honestly, Denver just won the title, right? Denver has been noted as a cheap organization. Milwaukee, same thing. And I'm not saying that Trey is Giannis and Jokic because he's not, but when they started to spend money, it's because they kind of had to, both to appease their stars and also because they were kind of already on the cusp of that. You can argue whether the Hawks were already there in 2021. That seemed like more of a fluke than anything else, not trying to be a negative thing about it. They weren't on that level as a team quality from that season. They had that great run and it happened. But I wonder if they're more nudged in that direction by success. And I think they're hoping for that too. And when you were talking a second ago, it's popping in my head. You and I have been talking about sort of consolidation trades for probably 3 or 4 years now. And they've never made one still. And honestly, if I asked you that 3 years ago, by the middle of 23, will they have made a consolidation trade? It would have definitely been a yes. And they just haven't. And unfortunately, what they've done instead was shed Herter and shed Collins in different kind of more maddening ways. But it is a surprise to me. And I haven't really thought about this in a while, but I think we're all looking for that trade still, because like you said a second ago, no team basically keeps their entire 8-9 player core together. That just doesn't happen. But they haven't done one of those very obvious 2-for-1, 3-for-1 trades that we're all kind of waiting on, I feel like.
Right. I mean, you can make the argument that Murray does kind of represent that, but like you said, they really just did it with future picks. They didn't really do it by consolidating young guys or anything like that.
Murray was Gallinari and picks. It wasn't actually any of the young core play. I mean, I know, and Reddish didn't work out. Obviously, they trade Herter, but none of the guys that we've thought about as those consolidation pieces have been moved. They're all either still here or they were moved by themselves in kind of sell-off trades. It's kind of strange the way it's happened.
Yeah, I agree with that. And right now, it's also just hard to do because you don't really know how to value these guys. Griffin had a very impressive teenage rookie season, something that you rarely see from a 19-year-old to put up those efficiency numbers and the shot profile that he had. But he hasn't played long enough to where you can say, okay, this guy looks like somebody that could be a future top 40 player. There's just not enough sample size from that you can give, teams around the league that type of suggestion in a trade that he could be, the primary piece in a trade that nets you some kind of star or something like that. So I think that this year, really getting a longer look at those guys is going to be really pivotal for the long term, just because, especially for Jalen Johnson, just because he's had a couple years in the oven. I think you're going to get I get the sense that Snyder just really likes him, just from a versatility standpoint, the passing, the basketball IQ. I just think he's a really good fit for him in particular. So he's someone that I would say I'm probably most excited to watch this year, just to kind of get a look at his progression, especially with the shot. If he can add the shot and add some respectability there, then it really does open a lot for him. But overall, I do like their position as far as like a combination of contracts, proven talent in Murray and Young, and then some intriguing young talent. And obviously now they have the best coach they've had since Budenholzer. So you have confidence at least they're going to be deployed the right way. And just on a lesser note too, like I liked some of the moves they made in the margins this year. Like Wes Matthews was a really good get, I thought, for the minimum. Obviously he's getting longer in the tooth, but I think getting a guy that is still a good defender who has versatility, defending across guard spots is really nice to have. He's somebody they can play with either of their 2 point guards is nice. Patty Mills too, just as an emergency ball handler, I think he's nice to have around. A great locker room guy, somebody that's always been on winning teams, has been a champion before. Both these guys, I think, they don't have a lot left in the league, but I do like the improvement as far as like, that 10 to 12 spots in the rotation over the last year. So I think the depth on this team is pretty good. I've listened to like the Low Post and some of the national pods, and I have heard that sentiment a bit. I mean, it's still pretty improving depth outside of like Bogdanovich and Okongwu in the bench. There's still some guys that we haven't seen in true rotation roles. So we are kind of projecting there, but I really do like their 9-man rotation a good bit. And I think the fringe depth is improved over last year too. So overall, I do like their offseason, even if it hasn't had like this major move outside of the Collins trade.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that too, because that's something I know we talked about offline, but one of the sneaky things they did last year in the middle of the season was just improve their depth. And it was not sexy at all, but because guys like Garrison Matthews and Bruno Fernando are not sexy, but they were better than what they had before. And of course, Saddiq Bey got more attention, and rightfully so, and he improved their depth. Now, of course, you lose Collins, so that takes away a little bit of it. But they're so much better right now, 9 to 14, 10 to 14, than they were last year. And yeah, you take Collins out and move everybody up, but the combination of the improved depth, and I'm with you on Wes Matthews in particular. I think Mills might be kind of cooked, but even if he doesn't have to play, just being a veteran presence, another guy that you can put out there to kind of mentor Kobe Buffkin, all that stuff is probably good. And then, you do get a full season of Saddiq Bey, and like you brought up Snyder. So I wanted to ask you about Snyder too before I forget to do that. Best coach since Bud is something I definitely agree with. I know Nate led them to a conference finals, but I think Quin Snyder is a much better coach than Emmett Millen. And like, I did Josh Lloyd's podcast, Locked On Fantasy Basketball, this week, and I think he was a little bit surprised by my framing, but like I'm picking the Hawks to be significantly better than they were last year, even acknowledging that, I get the roster sort of, pullback because of the fact that they didn't really improve in the way that you might imagine. But I think the combination of, and you can stop me if you disagree with me, but like the combination of internal improvement on young guys who, growth is not linear. I'm always the first one to say that, but I think you can reasonably expect guys like Griffin and Johnson to be better than they were a year ago, just by being another year in. And I think even if you go player by player, we don't have to do that. I don't know about you, Andrew. Like, nobody had a great season last year. Like, guys were fine. Like, Trey played fine. It wasn't like it wasn't like anybody was terrible, but like it wasn't like there's anybody that has like a stark regression to expect. Maybe the older guys, your Bogies and Clint, just from age stuff, but like none of their core guys, Trey included, had like great seasons for them. DeJounte, same thing. So like I think there's some reason to believe in an uptick, and it's like a combination of all of those things. But I feel like they're also banking on Snyder quite a bit, because that's kind of the only thing that you can kind of point to as being quote unquote new, is this new voice in the room.
Yeah, I'm with you on all points. Each offseason, there's always one team that I attack as far as over-unders on the overside. Like 2 years ago, I really liked the Timberwolves. I thought they were going to have a good year. And last year, I was really on the Kings. I remember when we did the offseason pod last year, I picked the Hawks to be a play-in team. I liked getting DeJounte, but when you factor in what they left, what they lost, I didn't think they really improved all that much. But with this year, they don't have a lame duck coach anymore. I think we're going to get more positive regression from Trey as far as, an efficiency standpoint. You also have one more year of the fit with DeJounte, where I expect to see more improvement there. I think that the shooting overall is improved from last year. I think they were 30th last year in 3-point. It was either percentage or attempts. I can't remember. But just the improvement, having Bogdanovich having a healthy offseason, I think is big. And then you have Griffin that I think is going to add a lot in shooting, as well as Bey. So I think the team has the outlines more of being a Snyder team than the one he took over midseason, which is really constructed to be a Nate McMillan team, a team that's going to play slow, try to avoid turnovers, play for the mid-range, and defend. this year, I think it just makes more coherent sense for how Snyder wants to approach things. So overall, I am pretty optimistic. I mean, there's a good bit of projection involved just because you have to expect guys like Griffin and Jalen Johnson to make significant leaps to be positive rotation players. But I think the early signs there have been promising. I mean, Griffin, he's really just, his trajectory has just been nothing but up and to the right for really the last, the back half of that season. The way he closed was just so impressive to me. So overall, yeah, I really do like them as an over team this year. I think they're going to be a top 6 seed. A point that I've made to you a lot too offline is I really think they need to win a playoff series this year. Like there's just a lot of questions about the team for a lot of reasons. The front office, Trey, I think has reached the point of now being one of the most underrated players in the league. Like I really just, I say that like confidently. I think he's one of the most underrated players in the league now. And I think that he really does need to have both a good individual season and some playoff success to kind of dispel some of the notions about him and also get him some of the opportunities that he wants as far as, postseason recognition, as far as like all NBA teams, having a chance to play for Team USA. He really needs to try and change the perception of him. So I think it is really important to win a playoff series this year. That's in part why I'm not as high on like cashing in Capella if the offer isn't good enough, because I think he's somebody that can help you get that favorable matchup. They really need to try to get to that 4 or 5 seed, kind of deal where they're basically even money to win that series. I remember after the season, Capella, I thought, had a really good quote that if they want to go deeper in the playoffs, they need to be better in the regular season to get better matchups. So I think that's I think that's a very pertinent point. And I think that's something that they're going to really focus on in the regular season, is just try not to come out slow and try and establish things early and put themselves in position to be a top 5 seed. So yeah, I like them a lot this year.
I'm sure I'll talk about this more as we get into training camp and October and all that stuff. But like, I agree with the premise that you put out there of like, this is kind of an important season, which every season is important. But, the fact that like ownership level and beyond, like they've still, I know it breaks everybody's brain, but like, this has never been what I would describe as a good regular season team. They had basically one run of 2 months in 2001 and 2021 where they were really good, from like, late, February to March or whatever it was. And then that's kind of it. They've always been, they haven't been bad either. They've been a 500-ish team, but Clint's point is right. I'm glad you brought it up. Like, there are some exceptions, of course, but most teams in the NBA, for you to have real success, you need to like prove you can go out and win. 50 is kind of an arbitrary benchmark that people use. Like even, go win 47 games, go win 48 games. That would be a large step forward from where they've been the last couple of years. And like, I think it's very attainable, but the teams will take you seriously if you are not able to do that. And like, and then once you get to that point, then there's the next step of like, what you don't want to be is like the, 10 years ago Hawks that were there every year and everyone knew that was all they were going to be able to do. That's a different problem, but honestly, that's a good problem to have. Like if you're just good every year, like actually good every year, that's not a bad thing to be in general. But yeah, I think it's a really important point that you're making. And I think it's one that, again, is attainable, but they have some stuff to prove. And taking it back to what we talked about earlier in the podcast, like, I think if your ownership, especially this owner with, all he's indicated in terms of what his actions are, if they don't win at a high level, I'm talking about like high 40s or better this year, and maybe win a playoff series, to your point, like I don't see them, investing more. Like it's one of those things where like, I think there has to be some sort of proof of concept. And I think we believe it. We watch this stuff closely. And I think there's a very interesting and like pretty easy nuanced pitch as to like how this team gets a lot better this year, but they have to actually do it. And like, let's just say this. This would be year 3 of middling. If their over under right now is 41.5 wins. I've already said I'll be over on that. You just said the same thing.
Yeah, way over.
Let's just say though, they win 42 games this year without like some crazy injury or whatever. That's not a good result, man. Like that'd be 3 seasons in a row of really being mediocre. Like the jokes all year last year were not untrue about just how mid they were. And they weren't even hurt. Like they had a pretty healthy roster. Like if that happens again, then you start asking the big picture questions. Then I'm not trying to say it's going to happen, but it might. You start getting a lot more external heat about like, what are you even doing down here? So like, I don't want to place too much pressure on this team this season. I think internally, like they're going to expect some results here with Quinn and that investment and all the stuff that they've been doing. It's like a very interesting place to be because they didn't push all in by any means, but they are invested pretty heavily.
Yeah, it's low key an important year. It's kind of the way I look at it. Like they're still a young enough team where if things don't go quite as planned this year, they still have outs.
Agreed.
But with the investment they made in Murray, with bringing in Snyder, with the heat that Trey's getting, they need to take a step forward in my view. And personally, like I see them being like a 47-48 win team. I just think that the leap that they're going to make under Snyder in his second year is going to be substantive. But I think it is important to have a good showing in the playoffs. Like this past year, they really overachieved. There was never a point where you thought they were going to win the series, I don't think, but they didn't get annihilated like they did the year prior. I think you could see the outlines of a potential good team, especially on offense. But really, they need to have a good showing in part to show that they could be an attractive destination for higher end talent. Like you need to be able to persuade guys like a Siakam, for example, who has been very hesitant to leave Toronto for a number of reasons, of course. But you want to make the case that you're not that far away to establish talent. You know, you have a lot of guys that are not yet in their prime or only about to enter the prime. So that could be appealing for guys if you have a proof of concept, like you said, but they really just need to show that they have made a demonstrable step forward this coming season. And so I think winning a playoff series is really like the goal for me anyway.
All right, that is going to be it for today's podcast with myself and Andrew Kelly. If you are wondering, part 2 will be available tomorrow, in addition to the Atlanta Hawks regular season schedule, which will be coming out on Thursday afternoon/evening. So my plan is to touch on the high points of the schedule on Thursday and then attach that to part 2 with Andrew, as I'll be traveling in the middle of the day on Thursday as well. But with all that said, please subscribe to this podcast so you can ensure you can get every single episode delivered directly to you. You can find us anywhere you get your podcast, places like Apple and Spotify, as well as YouTube on the video side. Please follow the show on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks. Follow me on that platform at BT Rowland. And one more time, thank you for listening to the podcast, and we'll see you all tomorrow with some schedule talk and more with Andrew Kelly.